It had rained for 3 days straight before she vanished. The kind of rain that pounded the rooftops like fists and churned the river until it swallowed its own banks. Roads turned to streams. The forest paths bled into the earth. Mothers held their children close and told them not to look at the lightning, not to listen too hard to the thunder, because sometimes the storm could remember your name. She was last seen the night the rain paused for a single hour. Her name had been spoken often, sometimes with fondness, sometimes with unease. She was the girl who laughed at the wrong moments, who asked too many questions, who walked barefoot even in the cold. Some said her eyes were too bright, like she was always listening to something you couldn't hear. Others said she never should have survived her mother's death, that a woman who dies screaming in childbirth leaves a part of her soul behind, and sometimes it latches on to the baby. She had lived with her stepmother since she was 8. The woman had married her father just before he fell ill, and buried him 6 months later. It wasn't said out loud, but no one in the village trusted the stepmother. She smiled too wide. She was too generous when people were watching and too silent when they weren't. Still, she had taken the girl in, raised her, dressed her in second-hand robes, taught her to grind herbs and clean the house and keep her head low. And the girl had done it all, but always with that quiet glint in her eye. Like she knew something the stepmother didn't. Then one morning she was gone. At first, the stepmother claimed nothing. She acted normal, collected water, greeted the baker. But by midday she went to the village square and called for help. She said the girl had gone out before dawn to gather mushrooms near the river and never returned. She looked worried. Not desperate. Not frantic. Just inconvenienced. The search began that afternoon. Men with lanterns scoured the woods. Dogs sniffed her bedding and traced the scent until the trail vanished near the south ridge. One of the boys claimed he found a scrap of her scarf snagged on a branch near the water. Someone else found her shoe, half buried in the mud, but it was clean, too clean as if it had been placed there. No one said it aloud, but the villagers were thinking it. Drowned. The river had risen so high that even the old stones were submerged. If she had slipped, if her foot had caught, she could have been swept away in seconds. No body would be found for days, if ever. The rain would wash it far. The stepmother began wearing black the next morning. She didn't wail. She didn't wait for proof. She spoke of the girl in past tense. She shut the windows, lit incense, and told anyone who asked that she was preparing for the rites. When the village elder asked to delay any declaration until more evidence surfaced, she pressed a small bag of silver into his hand and whispered, "It's for the best. Let her be mourned. Let her be at peace." And so it was declared, the girl was dead. A funeral was scheduled for 5 days later. No one was to speak her name during the mourning period. Her friends were told to stay away from the river. Her room was sealed with herbs and blessed by the priest. The stepmother sat in her front yard with dry eyes and a perfect posture, nodding as neighbors murmured their sympathies. But something felt wrong. The weaver's daughter, who had once braided flowers into the girl's hair, claimed she heard tapping on her window at night, a soft, steady knock that stopped the moment she sat up in bed. The baker's apprentice found handprints on the flour sacks one morning, small, familiar ones, though the bakery had been locked tight. A dog at the edge of the village refused to go near the river anymore, whining and howling at dusk, tail between its legs. Still no one said anything. Grief had its rules. And the dead, even if they vanished in silence, deserved a clean goodbye. But behind closed doors the whispers grew louder. Some said she had never gone to the river at all. That she had argued with her stepmother the night before, loud enough to be overheard by the neighbor's son who swore he'd heard something heavy fall. Others remembered stories, old ones, about girls marked by strange births, by thunder and dying mothers. Stories of children who saw spirits, who carried parts of the other world inside them. Children who disappeared and returned, different. The priest spoke against such rumors, demanding silence and respect for the dead. He insisted the girl had likely wandered too far, lost her footing and been taken by the river. He urged the village to come together in peace, to pray for her soul, and to prepare themselves for the ceremony. He did not mention why the casket had to remain closed. No one was allowed to see the body. That was the stepmother's doing. She claimed it was too disfigured, too bloated from the water. She said she had identified it by the clothes alone, the scarf, the dress, the bracelet of old beads. Let her rest with dignity, she said, placing her hand to her heart. Let her go as she was, whole. But some noticed that the bracelet she spoke of still sat on her dresser. A few brave souls gathered late one night behind the blacksmith's shed and traded stories. The stable boy said he saw a figure walking along the forest path 2 nights before, barefoot, hair hanging wet down her back. The seamstress swore she felt cold fingers brush her shoulder as she walked past the girl's old room. Even the village elder's wife confessed she had a dream, a vivid one, where the girl stood at the foot of her bed and whispered, "I'm not done yet." Still, when the day of the funeral came, the village gathered. Rain clouds rolled in again, fat and low. The priest stood at the head of the procession, swinging incense and chanting prayers. The casket was carried by 4 chosen men, heavy, sealed with iron nails, marked with runes for protection. No one spoke above a whisper. The girl's friends held hands and wept. The stepmother led the way, face veiled in fine black lace, her cries too loud, too well-timed, falling between words like they'd been rehearsed. They laid the casket in the center of the stone circle behind the temple. The fire was lit. The air grew thick with smoke and unsaid things. But no one asked again to see the body. And no one noticed the small trail of muddy footprints leading from the edge of the forest to the far side of the graveyard, half hidden, half fresh. No one but the trees. And they whispered. The morning of the funeral arrived with a kind of silence that felt wrong. Not the respectful hush that usually falls over a mourning village, but a tense, waiting kind of silence, as if even the wind was holding its breath. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of another storm. Gray clouds loomed in the sky like bruises. The trees didn't move. The birds didn't sing. It was as though everything had paused to see what would happen next. The announcement had come the night before. A bell had rung 3 times, not at the usual hour, not with the usual tone. 3 hollow strikes in the dead of night, each one reverberating through the valley like a warning. Those who heard it sat up in bed, clutching their blankets, waiting for someone to explain. And then came the message, passed mouth to mouth, carried by neighbors and whispers. The funeral would take place at dawn. No viewing. No procession. No final blessing. The casket would be sealed and burned before the sun reached its peak. She would have wanted it this way, the stepmother had said to the priest, her face pale but composed. It's what's best. She didn't cry when she said it. But when the sun began to rise and the villagers slowly gathered at the old temple ground, she stood at the front of the circle, swathed in black lace and long silk gloves, a veil pulled low over her face, sobbing so loudly that it startled the birds from the trees. Her wails were sharp, high-pitched, not the kind that came from real grief but from someone trying to sound like grief. Her shoulders shook in dramatic spasms. Her fingers clutched a silk handkerchief so tightly the fabric tore at the edges. People watched her, but no one said anything. Because what could they say? It wasn't unusual to cry at a funeral. It wasn't unusual to cry loudly. But there was something theatrical in her mourning. A performative quality that made it hard to look away. She was too loud, too controlled. Her sobs fell right in time with the priest's prayers, as if she had memorized the rhythm of the grief she thought she was supposed to show. Behind her, the casket sat on a stone pedestal. It was made of dark wood, polished to a dull sheen, with metal bands wrapped tight across it like arms holding it closed. No one had been allowed to touch it. No one had seen the girl's face, not even her closest friends. The stepmother had claimed the body was too disfigured by the river. That the water had stolen her features. That seeing her in that state would only bring pain. The villagers didn't argue. But they didn't believe her either. A funeral without a face was like a book without a story, hollow, unsatisfying, wrong. Her friends stood together in a quiet cluster near the back. The weaver's daughter, the baker's niece, the girl from the fishing huts who used to sneak her sweets wrapped in paper. They didn't speak, but their eyes moved often toward the casket. Toward the stepmother. Toward the sky. They had known her. Not just in passing, not just in the way people know each other in small villages, but deeply. They had shared secrets under blankets, raced barefoot along the riverbank, braided each other's hair and dreamed aloud of a life beyond the mountain. And something inside each of them, something unshakable, was whispering now that this was not right. She would have wanted it this way, the stepmother repeated, turning to the crowd with her arms outstretched as if expecting comfort. She was private. She was shy. She never liked attention. That wasn't true. They remembered her climbing the old fig tree and shouting poems to the birds. They remembered her dancing barefoot in the village square when the rain finally broke after last year's drought. They remembered the way she laughed, bold, reckless, like a girl who believed the world should echo her joy. She had never been shy. She had been watchful. There's a difference. The priest began to chant the old words, slow and reverent. Smoke curled from the incense pots, thick and sweet. Someone threw a handful of petals into the fire and they crackled like dry leaves. The casket remained sealed, still, unmoving. Then came the final rites. The part where the family speaks, shares a memory, a truth, a farewell. The stepmother stepped forward, her veil trembling with every exaggerated sob. She placed one gloved hand on the casket and closed her eyes. "My sweet girl," she began, her voice catching just enough to seem dramatic. "You were a light in this dark world. So gentle. So innocent. Taken too soon. I can only pray the river carries you to peace." Her words felt rehearsed. Every phrase was perfect, like something plucked from a script. No mention of the arguments they'd had. No mention of the days she'd made the girl kneel for hours grinding herbs without water. No mention of the time she'd slapped her so hard she bled from the ear. Just sweet lies wrapped in silk. The priest raised his hand to bless the body. The stepmother reached into her cloak and drew out a thin chain with a charm attached. A small metal coin, tarnished and old, etched with a symbol no one recognized. She placed it gently on top of the casket, right where the heart would be, and whispered something too soft to hear. Then she stepped back, dabbing at her dry cheeks with her torn handkerchief. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Someone muttered that it was strange there was no viewing. Someone else whispered that the girl's bracelet, the one she never took off, had been seen just yesterday in the stepmother's dressing table. But no one said anything aloud. Because fear is a powerful silencer. And grief, even when false, is a shield no one wants to challenge. The priest gestured to the two chosen torchbearers. They moved forward, dipping their torches into the sacred fire, carrying its flame to the edge of the pyre built around the casket. The wood was dry, wrapped in old prayer cloth. It would burn quickly. The ceremony would end. But before the flames were laid, a child spoke. "Why is she locked in?" asked a small voice, a boy no older than 6, holding his mother's hand. "Why did they chain her shut?" The mother hushed him quickly. Too quickly. She glanced nervously at the priest, at the stepmother, then toward the woods. The priest ignored it. The torches touched the wood. The fire caught. And the weaver's daughter turned her eyes toward the tree line. Because she swore, just for a moment, she had seen a figure standing between the trunks, watching. Then, still, barefoot, and smiling. Her fingers curled into fists. The casket burned slowly, stubbornly. The flames licked the edges, dancing over the metal bands. Smoke poured upward, thick and black. The stepmother began to cry again, louder now, almost as if she were trying to drown something out. But the weaver's daughter kept her eyes on the trees. Because what she had seen, she was sure of it. That was no ghost. That was her. She crouched beneath the thick limbs of the elder trees, the bark pressing rough against her back, the moss wet beneath her knees. Her heart pounded too loudly in her chest, and she feared for a moment that someone down there would hear it, would look up and find her among the leaves. But no one looked toward the forest. All eyes were fixed on the fire, on the smoke rising from the casket they believed held her body. She didn't dare breathe too deeply. The smoke from the burning would reach even the trees, carrying with it the scent of old cloth, resin, and something else, something metallic and wrong. She pressed her hand against her mouth and closed her eyes. They thought she was dead. They believed it. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. Her fingers curled around the edge of a low branch as she leaned forward slightly, peering through a gap in the leaves. From here she could see everything, the circle of mourners, the priest chanting over the flames, the casket nearly swallowed now by fire, and her stepmother standing just beside it, crying in great heaving sobs. She watched her own funeral from the shadows. No one knew she was alive. No one knew what had happened to her. Not even she understood it completely. The last thing she remembered clearly was the cup of tea, bitter, too dark, with a strange aftertaste, and her stepmother's voice saying, "Drink it all now. It's good for sleep." She'd obeyed out of habit more than trust. The woman had raised her, after all, if not kindly, then at least consistently. And when the warmth spread through her body, she had believed it was simply exhaustion. But then the room had shifted sideways. The walls blurred. The floor twisted. Her limbs had turned heavy, her eyes refusing to stay open. She remembered collapsing, slowly, too slowly, and the cool edge of the tiles against her cheek. She had tried to speak, but no sound came. She had tried to lift her fingers, but they did not move. And then everything had gone black. She woke in darkness. Enclosed. Cramped. Wood all around her. The air had been stale, her breath loud in her own ears. Panic set in fast, violent and overwhelming. She'd screamed or tried to, but there had been cloth in her mouth, something tight around her wrists. Her lungs burned. Her body thrashed. Then, through the slats in the wood, she saw a sliver of moonlight. And she remembered. She was in a box. A casket. Alive. It had taken every ounce of strength and every stolen breath to claw her way out. The The wood had splintered her hands. Her nails tore. Her skin bled. But panic gave her power. She kicked until something cracked. Pushed until something shifted. When the lid finally gave way, she burst out like a beast, gasping, shaking, covered in sweat and blood and dirt. She was alone. In the temple's lower chamber. The body was meant to be kept hidden until the funeral, and clearly no one had bothered to guard it. Who would, when the girl inside was supposed to be dead? She ran. Stumbling, blind, through the passageways, avoiding torchlight and muffled voices. She crawled through the old prayer tunnel long abandoned, which opened at the edge of the woods. And there, beneath the shelter of the trees, she collapsed again. This time she didn't sleep. She listened. She waited. For 2 days she had remained hidden. Watching. Gathering her strength. Trying to understand. And now, here she was, watching the final act of her death from the safety of the forest. Her throat ached from dryness. Her lips were cracked. Her hands still trembled from the withdrawal of whatever drug her stepmother had used. But her mind was sharp. Too sharp. That woman had tried to kill her. Had buried her alive. And now she was crying over her burning casket as if she were the grieving mother. It made her sick. She looked toward the group of girls at the edge of the gathering, her friends. She saw their faces, wide-eyed, uncertain, afraid. The way they glanced toward the trees from time to time made her heart clench. Had they seen her? Had they felt her? She wanted to call out. She wanted to run to them, collapse into their arms, scream the truth for all to hear. But she couldn't. Not yet. Because the one thing she had learned in the short hours since her escape was this. Someone had planned all of this. Carefully. Ruthlessly. And it wasn't just her stepmother. There was power involved. The way the body, the false body, had looked like her. The strange charm her stepmother had placed on the casket. The metal chains sealed across it, not to keep intruders out, but perhaps to keep something in. The way the priest had refused to let anyone see her face. It wasn't just fear. It was knowledge. They knew something unnatural had happened. And they were part of it. She remembered now, in flashes, the chanting she'd heard in the dark. The cold fingers brushing her brow. The feel of something being placed over her heart while she couldn't move. A ritual. An exchange. Something old. They hadn't just wanted her dead. They had wanted her soul. She swallowed hard and looked back down at the fire. The casket was almost completely engulfed now, the flames roaring higher than they should have, bending strangely as if something inside was resisting. The priest's face was pale beneath the firelight. Her stepmother had stopped crying. She was watching the flames too closely. Like she was waiting for something. And then the fire cracked loud, like bone, and the wind shifted. Smoke blew into the crowd. Some people coughed. Others backed away. One of the girls, the weaver's daughter, took a step forward instead, staring hard at the trees. Her eyes passed over the place where the real girl hid. And they locked eyes. Only for a breath. But it was enough. The girl in the trees shook her head slowly. A warning. Not yet. Don't say anything. The weaver's daughter blinked, stunned. But she nodded. The fire began to die down. The priest declared the soul cleansed. The villagers began to disperse. A few lingered, speaking in low voices, casting glances at the stepmother. She stood stiff, unmoving, the tear-stained veil still covering her face, but her mouth was set in a thin, straight line. She wasn't grieving. She was watching. Waiting. The girl in the shadows stepped back, deeper into the forest. Her body ached. Her mind raced. She had to find out what they had done. Why they had done it. And what the fire was really meant to destroy. Because she knew now, deep in her bones, that whatever had been in that casket wasn't her. And if it wasn't her, then what was it? The shadows closed around her as she turned and disappeared into the trees. The fire behind her hissed. And the smoke curled into the sky like a question no one yet dared ask. Ask ChatGPT. The final rite was about to begin when the thunder rolled in from the east, slow and deep, like something ancient waking from sleep. It echoed across the hills, vibrating through the stones beneath the temple ground, shaking dust loose from the corners of the old shrine. The villagers paused, their eyes lifting skyward. The priest faltered mid-sentence, his voice trailing off into the sudden hush. All eyes turned to the sky. A low rumble. Then silence. Then another crack, louder this time, sharper. The sound split the air clean in half, and somewhere beyond the trees, a hawk cried out in alarm. The casket sat at the center of the sacred circle, flames licking around its base, the wood crackling in protest. It had burned slower than expected. The cloth that wrapped it had smoldered, the edges curling inwards like petals retreating from a withering sun. But the main body of the casket had not collapsed. It resisted. The iron bindings around it remained cold despite the fire. The charm placed on top by the stepmother had turned black but stayed intact. The priest tried to resume the chant, his voice a little thinner now, a little rushed. He circled the flames once, then again, lifting a handful of ash and scattering it into the wind. The stepmother stood nearby, stiff and watchful. Her eyes were locked on the casket, not in mourning but in concentration. Then the third thunderclap hit. This one had weight. It was like the earth itself had been slapped, like something massive and invisible had dropped from the sky. Several villagers staggered backward. A child screamed. One of the fire attendants dropped his torch. The flames surged upward without warning, rising in a pillar, then snapping back down just as quickly. And then, the casket moved. No one saw it at first. There was a creaking sound almost too soft to notice under the wind. A shift in the weight. The wood groaned. A tremble ran through the iron bands like a ripple across still water. Then a loud thud from within. Someone gasped. The stepmother turned pale. The casket rattled again, this time unmistakable. It rocked once, then again. The iron nails in the corners groaned. One snapped loose and clattered to the stone. A second nail fell with a dull metallic ring. The priest stopped chanting. No one moved. The casket lid rose half an inch, just enough for air to escape. A burst of cold wind poured from the crack, strong enough to blow ash into the priest's eyes and send the incense smoke in the opposite direction. The girl's friend stepped back instinctively. More nails popped loose. One by one. Click, click, click. The charm on top began to vibrate, humming against the wood. The metal bands lifted slightly, bent upward, no longer holding. The wind howled through the circle like a scream. Then the lid lifted. Not by force. Not thrown open. Just a slow, deliberate rise, like someone inside had placed gentle fingers against it and pushed. It tilted upward just enough to see what was inside. And that was enough. Every breath in the circle caught. It was her. But it wasn't. The body inside the casket was shaped like the girl. Same height. Same limbs. Same long black hair fanned around her shoulders like riverweed. The face was near perfect. Soft brows, a small mouth, a scar on the right temple just where she'd fallen as a child. But the eyes were wrong. They were open. Not glazed over in death, not dimmed by sleep, but wide open, round, glassy, fixed on nothing. They were too wide. The whites were too white. The irises too pale, almost silvery, like the surface of still water under moonlight. And then, it blinked. The priest stumbled backward, dropping his censer. Hot coals spilled across the stones. Smoke erupted. The villagers screamed and scattered. The weaver's daughter pulled her younger brother behind her. One of the elders fainted. A dog began barking furiously from the edge of the temple. The stepmother made a sound, high and guttural, halfway between rage and terror, and reached forward as if to slam the lid shut again. But the lid slammed itself shut before she could. Art. With a boom that echoed louder than the thunder before it. The fire beneath the casket roared again, shooting straight upward. Flames licked the iron bands, and this time the bands began to melt. The charm cracked in two. The lid sealed again, like something inside had decided it wasn't ready to be seen. Or, like it had shown enough. The priest dropped to his knees. In the name of the old gods, he whispered, trembling. That was not the girl. The stepmother stood frozen, her hands at her sides, her eyes locked on the casket like she could will it back into stillness. Her lips moved silently. Not in prayer. In denial. Or fury. Or both. And up in the trees, where the real girl still watched, crouched behind the thick tangle of limbs, her breath caught in her throat. She had seen it too. And though she had expected something strange, something wrong, this was worse. Because it wasn't just a fake body. It wasn't just a doll or a trick or a lifeless decoy. It had blinked. It had looked like her, down to the tiniest detail. But that thing inside the casket had been alive. Or something like alive. And it had moved. She turned her face away, bow rising in her throat. Her hands were shaking. Her body was too cold despite the heat of the fire below. Whatever spell they had used, whatever rite they had performed when she was unconscious, it hadn't just been to make people think she was dead. It had been to replace her. The thing in the casket wasn't human. And it wasn't finished. She scanned the crowd below. Panic had broken the solemnity of the funeral. Villagers ran in different directions. Some clung to each other. Others fell to their knees, weeping, chanting old prayers they barely remembered. The priest had stopped pretending everything was under control. He was mumbling to himself now, sprinkling herbs into the air, tracing protective signs in the ash. Only the stepmother stood firm. She was whispering now, too fast to understand. Her fingers moved in tight circles against her palm. Her lips formed ancient syllables. And for a brief moment, her eyes flicked toward the forest. Right toward the place the real girl watched from. Their gazes met. And the stepmother smiled. It was a slow, knowing smile. One that chilled the girl to the bone. It was not a smile of surprise. It was not a look that said, "I thought you were dead." It was a look that said, "Ah, so you're still watching." And beneath it, another message. "But you're too late." The wind howled again. The casket finally gave in to the fire, collapsing inward with a loud crunch. The body inside was engulfed in flames that burned with a strange color, blue at the edges, gold at the core. The scent of the air changed, burned metal, salt, and something like old flowers rotting in water. The fire didn't smell like a body. It smelled like magic. The villagers began to retreat in full now. The sacred circle emptied. The funeral was over. And not a single soul dared to ask what they'd seen. Except for one. The weaver's daughter, still standing near the edge of the circle, stared up at the trees again. She mouthed the name she had not been allowed to say for days. The girl in the shadows nodded once. Then she turned and disappeared deeper into the forest. Because she understood now. This wasn't about mourning. This was a theft. And she intended to take herself back. Even after the fire had been extinguished and the last rites forcibly concluded, the villagers could not stop talking about what they had seen, or what they thought they had seen. They whispered as they left the temple ground, glancing over their shoulders, their faces pale beneath the thick smoke that still lingered like an unwelcome ghost. The air felt altered, unsettled, as though the thunder hadn't left but only sunk into the ground, waiting. The priest, for all his practiced calm, had collapsed in the temple's inner chamber moments after the casket fell in on itself. He sat now against the stone wall, hands shaking, a bowl of blessed water untouched beside him. He muttered old names under his breath, names that hadn't been spoken in generations. Names the villagers had long since been told to forget. "What did you see?" someone asked him. He didn't answer, because to say it aloud would make it real. The villagers who had been closest to the casket, those who had glimpsed the thing before the lid slammed shut, all gave different accounts but none were comforting. One swore its eyes were made of glass. Another insisted its skin had seams, like it had been stitched together. A third whispered that she saw it breathe, a slow rising breath that carried no warmth. But all agreed on one thing: it looked like the girl. Too much like her. Uncannily like her. So perfectly alike that it had to be wrong. And that wrongness clung to them like soot. It followed them home and into their dreams. Children cried through the night. Dogs whimpered at the base of their masters' beds. The air seemed to crackle at odd hours, especially near water, as if something were always waiting to be noticed. The elder priest, not the young one who had led the service, but the oldest among them who had not been seen in weeks, emerged that evening from his hut on the cliffside. He had been sick for months, too weak to walk, his bones like reeds, his voice like paper. But now he came. He came barefoot, hunched, eyes ringed in red. And when they told him what had happened, he didn't blink. "Bring me what remains," he said. The casket had collapsed into char and bone, but the center of it, the part where the body had lain, had not burned properly. The fire had flickered strangely there, refusing to catch as it should have. When one of the bolder villagers reached in with a hooked staff and pulled out what was left, they gasped. It was still whole. Still intact. The figure that lay in the remains was the girl, and not. The hair was hers. The skin was hers. But there was something too smooth about it, too perfect. The face bore no signs of death, no bruising, no waterlogging. The mouth was slightly parted, but no air escaped. The hands were folded over the chest, holding a charm no one recognized, a small figurine of a horned bird with no eyes. The elder priest stared. He knelt beside the thing, touching nothing, only looking. "Spirit made," he whispered. "But not of the old way. This is twisted." Someone asked what he meant. He closed his eyes. "There are rites we abandoned generations ago. Rites that called on things beneath the river, behind the mountain. Not gods, not really, but old forces. Shadows with memory. The kind that take a name and hollow it out, wear it like a mask." He reached out with trembling fingers and touched the thing's forehead. Then he recoiled. "She was meant to be replaced," he said hoarsely. "This was not to mourn her. This was to take her place." The crowd gasped. But some had suspected. The way the stepmother had hurried the funeral. The closed casket. The false charm. One of the girls, the baker's niece, took a step forward. "If that's not her," she asked, Then where is she? The elder priest looked up. She must be close. The spirits would not allow the rite to complete unless the soul was bound nearby. But she's dead, someone whispered. We all saw. No, he said sharply. You saw a trick. And somewhere deep in the trees the real girl stood watching still. Her fingers clenched around a stone she had taken from her escape path, small, smooth, white with a dark crack down the middle. Her breath was fast, uneven. She had heard every word. She had seen the body. She had seen the face shaped like hers. And now she understood. She had not simply been meant to die. She had been meant to disappear, not just from life but from memory. The thing in the casket wasn't just a decoy. It was a replacement. A crafted echo meant to convince the world that she had died a gentle death, that she had been buried, burned, mourned. But the spirit doll in the casket had opened its eyes. And that meant something had gone wrong. The rite had failed. Or perhaps she had broken it just by surviving. Still she dared not come out. Not yet. The stepmother had power. The priest was shaken but not innocent. Others had been involved. The ritual had needed time, space, and silence to work, and it had been granted all three. But now the silence was cracking. The villagers were afraid. The elder priest stood slowly, supporting himself on a staff carved with symbols too old to name. He turned to the younger priest, the one who had led the ritual, the one who had chanted so calmly. You knew, he said softly. The younger priest didn't respond. You saw what she placed on the casket. The charm. You saw the signs. And you said nothing. Still no answer. The elder priest stepped closer, eyes narrowing. You forget what we guard. You forget the difference between honoring the dead and replacing the living. The younger priest lowered his head. I was told it was mercy. The elder spat to the side. Mercy does not wear another's face. And with that he turned back to the body. The spirit doll. The thing that looked like a girl who should have been dead. He raised a gourd from his belt, uncorked it, and let a single drop of oil fall onto the doll's brow. It hissed. The skin beneath it cracked. A soft whisper filled the air, not from the priest, not from the wind. From inside the doll. A voice layered and broken. She was not supposed to see. The villagers scattered. Even the bravest among them fled back down the hill, clutching charms, weeping prayers. Only the elder priest remained. And the thing that wore the girl's face began to melt. Not like flesh. Like wax. As if it had never been alive, only molded. The skin sloughed off in thick folds, revealing beneath it a lattice of woven bark, dried river grass, teeth that looked too human and too many. The eyes rolled backward, revealing a blank white surface, like stone polished clean. Then silence. Real silence. The doll collapsed in on itself, and the charm it had held in its hands shattered into 6 pieces, each glowing faintly before turning to dust. The elder priest knelt again. Forgive us, he whispered. Forgive what we almost allowed. Up in the trees the girl shivered. Because the ritual had failed, yes. But someone had wanted it to work. Someone had tried to erase her. And they had almost succeeded. But she was still here. She would stay hidden a little longer. Watch a little more. Because she had seen what lay in the casket. And now she needed to know who had helped make it, and why. Asked ChatGPT. She had waited long enough. The casket had burned, the ashes scattered, and still her breath remained steady in her chest. Her fingers trembled from exhaustion, from hunger, from the cold that lived deep in her bones now. But she no longer hid. Not from them. Not from what had been done to her. So she stood. Barefoot, dirt streaked along her ankles, hair tangled from days in the woods. Her face was gaunt but unmistakable, her eyes too alive to be denied. Her body cast a long shadow as she stepped through the tree line and onto the sacred burial ground where only moments ago her false body had been cremated. The villagers saw her all at once. A pause fell over the entire gathering, as if time itself refused to move forward until someone dared to make sense of what they saw. At first no one screamed. No one moved. Then someone whispered, "It's her." Another voice, "She's dead, she burned." And then chaos. Screams erupted like a wave crashing across the temple steps. Some stumbled back, knocking over urns and prayer bowls. Others dropped to their knees, clutching their charms and whispering frantic prayers to every god and spirit they could remember. One woman wailed so loudly that even the birds in the trees took flight. Children cried. Elders stared in stunned silence. The earth seemed to shift beneath them, too uncertain now to offer balance. The girl kept walking. She didn't speak. She didn't raise her hands. Her eyes moved slowly over each person's face, taking in their fear, their awe, the guilt in some, the confusion in others. She stopped just beyond the burned casket. The ash clung to the air. The shape of her false self had collapsed completely into soot and bone fragments. The iron bands were nothing more than twisted loops. The charm once placed over her heart was shattered on the stone. She looked at it, then looked up. The elder priest stood frozen a few feet away, a wooden staff clutched in his hands like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He said nothing at first, his mouth half open. Then finally, voice shaking. What sorcery is this?" She turned to him. "No sorcery," she said, her voice clear despite the dryness in her throat. "Just the truth." It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. The priest took a step forward, then stopped. "You were buried," he said. "Burned. The body was not mine." Murmurs, cries. One woman fainted on the spot. From the back of the crowd came a sharp cry, high-pitched and drawn out, followed by a thud. The stepmother had collapsed in a heap of black skirts and lace, her gloved hands twitching as she crumpled against the temple wall. No one rushed to her aid. No one lifted her. The girl didn't look at her. Not yet. The younger priest, the one who had led the funeral, moved forward now, face pale. This cannot be. You were confirmed, your body was replaced," she said, her voice sharper now. "You looked into the face of something made to deceive you, and you didn't even ask why it felt wrong." He stepped back like she had struck him. I was told you drowned, that you wished to go quietly. Your mother said." "She is not my mother." Those 6 words rang louder than any prayer. Silence dropped hard over the temple ground. The villagers watched with wide eyes as she stepped past the ashes of her own funeral, walking up the steps until she stood at the center of the sacred circle, where the fire had once burned. She raised her voice now, not shouting but commanding, letting the weight of her words carry. "I was drugged," she said. "Taken. Placed into the casket while still alive. A spirit doll was made to replace me. My name was nearly erased from your mouths, and you all stood there and said nothing. You mourned a lie." Several people dropped to their knees. One of her old friends, the weaver's daughter, covered her mouth with trembling fingers, tears streaking down her face. The girl's eyes met hers, and for the first time, something in her softened. She gave a small nod. "I saw you," the weaver's daughter whispered. "In the trees. I knew." The girl closed her eyes for half a breath. Then she turned. The stepmother was awake now, half lifted on her elbows, her face pale, hair falling loose from its pins. She looked like someone who had just seen a god she didn't believe in. Her lips moved but no sound came. The girl descended the steps. Every footstep rang against the stone. Slow. Certain. As if she had walked this path before, though it was her first time returning to life. She stopped just before her stepmother, who now dragged herself into a seated position, spine pressed against the temple wall, mouth twisting into something that might have been a smirk if her lips weren't quivering. "You weren't supposed to come back," the woman croaked. "And yet," the girl said, "here I am." "What do you want?" she spat. "A second funeral? Or do you mean to take mine now?" The girl crouched low, close enough to see the fear buried in the woman's eyes. "I want the truth," she said. "Every name. Every hand that helped you. Every word of the ritual you used. I want to know who gave you the charm. Who carved the doll. Who you promised my soul to." "I won't." "Speak," the girl interrupted. "Before the spirits make you." The stepmother's jaw clenched. Then she laughed. "What? Short. Bitter. You think they'll believe you? You think they have the stomach to admit what they saw? They'll choose the lie again. They always do." The girl stood and turned to the crowd. "I am not here to ask," she said. "I am here to remind." She pointed to the sky. The clouds, heavy all morning, finally split. Sunlight poured through, not warm but sharp, golden white like judgment. The wind shifted. The trees beyond the temple whispered her name. Not the one given at birth. The one that had been spoken by the leaves. The river. The bones of the forest. The villagers heard it. And something ancient in them stirred. The elder priest fell to his knees. "I remember," he whispered. "The old stories. The girl who dies and returns to carry the truth." The baker's niece joined him. Others followed. One by one they knelt. Not in worship. In apology. The girl did not smile. She looked down at her stepmother once more. "I don't need their belief," she said softly. "But I will have their memory." The stepmother opened her mouth to speak again, but choked instead. Her face contorted. Her eyes widened. And from beneath her skin, something pulsed. Something wrong. The girl stepped back. The charm, the one her stepmother had carried during the ritual, had begun to glow faintly through the folds of her dress, buried deep in a pocket or perhaps sewn into the lining. It had fed on something. And now it was trying to escape. The woman screamed once, short and sharp, and then crumpled. The charm fell from her cloak, rolling onto the temple floor. The elder priest reached forward, picked it up with a cloth and dropped it into the fire pit. It didn't burn. It shattered. And the wind fell silent. No one moved. The girl turned once more to the crowd. "I came back to be seen," she said. "Not worshipped. Not feared. Just seen." And for the first time the villagers nodded as one. She was no longer the girl who had died. She was the one who had returned. Asked ChatGPT. That evening, as the sky darkened and the clouds parted to reveal the round white eye of the moon, the elder priest called the village together one final time. The air was dense with the scent of ash and something older, burning herbs carried from the northern caves, bark soaked in river oils, white feathers braided with crimson thread. He stood on the highest stone and raised his hand. "By the old rites we will ask the spirits," he said. "If the girl is who she claims, if her return is of truth and not trickery, the wind will leave her skin unburned. But if she has carried back something she should not have, if her soul has been stained, the spirits will take her as their own." The people murmured, but none dared speak against him. Not even the girl. She stepped forward without fear. "I will walk," she said, her voice steady. The priest inclined his head, then turned to the gathered villagers. "We do not do this to punish. We do this to know. If she is touched by shadow, we must not let it live among us. If she is clean, the spirits will tell us. They will not harm their own." So it was set. They formed a ring at the edge of the sacred grove, where the burial stones met the wild woods. There, a path was marked with salt and crushed bone, lit on either side by low fires and smoke pots carved from stone, each filled with offerings to the spirits. Bitter root, boiled honey, ash from the girl's false funeral. A place no one walked unless called. The moon was high now, full and watching. She stood at the edge of the path, barefoot, thin white cloth wrapped around her shoulders. Her arms were bare. Her hair hung loose. She had been stripped of all charms, all names, all tools. Nothing to protect her. Nothing to deceive. Only her and the smoke. The priest stepped beside her, holding a bowl of river water. He dipped his fingers and drew a line down her brow, then whispered, "Let what is hidden be revealed." Then he stepped back. She took her first step. The smoke rose to meet her. It swirled up around her legs, thick and slow, as if reluctant to part. The fires flickered. Somewhere in the trees, a bird let out a long, mournful call. She kept walking. The smoke touched her skin like fingers. The path felt longer than it looked. Each step was measured, deliberate. The smoke grew darker as she moved deeper in, not from the flames but from something unseen. Something watching. The villagers stood still as stones, their breath held. Halfway through, the wind changed. A sudden gust rose from the ground, whirling the smoke into spirals. Some of it gathered above her head, like a crown of ash. She did not stop. Another gust, and the fires on the left side of the path turned blue. A woman cried out. Someone else stepped back. But the girl did not flinch. She walked through the firelight as though it had always belonged to her. Then, near the end of the path, the smoke thickened so violently that she vanished within it. For a moment the crowd saw nothing at all, only churning darkness, the scent of scorched salt, and a low hum, almost like voices just beneath the wind. Then silence. And out of the smoke she stepped. Unburned. Unbroken. The priest dropped to one knee. The wind died down. The smoke pulled back. And the path was clear again. She turned slowly to face them all. No mark lay upon her. Her skin was whole. The moonlight struck her face, and for the first time since her return, the villagers did not look away. They looked at her. And believed. Asked ChatGPT. By morning the village was silent. The fires had died down to soft embers, and the last of the ash from the false casket lay in gray piles across the stones. The sky was pale with new light, and a thin mist clung to the ground, curling through the streets like breath held too long. No one spoke aloud, not yet. Not after what had happened. Not after what they had seen. The girl stood alone before the pile of broken wood and bone dust. She had not slept. Her dress still smelled of smoke, and her eyes carried the kind of stillness that no child should wear. The casket, the one they had burned in her name, remained only in fragments now. Its iron bands twisted like vines, the charm melted into a smear of black resin across the stone. She did not flinch. Instead, she reached into the center of the ashes and pulled free a single shard of wood, still damp with cold and night. She held it in her palm, weighing it as if asking whether it still believed the lie it had been carved for. Then she set it down gently and lit a flame. The fire rose quickly, licking through the remains as if they'd only been waiting to be burned properly. This time the flame was clean. No green or black edges. No strange light. Just fire, bright and hot and true. The villagers watched from the edges of their homes. Doors half cracked. Curtains lifted just slightly. Some held offerings in their hands. Others whispered prayers. No one dared come close. She didn't need them to. The elder priest, the only one brave enough to stand beside her now, stepped forward. "What will you do?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. She looked beyond the village wall, past the grove, toward the place where they had buried her, the shallow grave dug in haste and secrecy, where her body had been meant to vanish. "I'm not staying," she said. He nodded slowly. "The forest will take you." She glanced at him. "No," she said. "I will take the forest." He bowed his head. When the fire had eaten through the last of the casket remains, she turned from it without ceremony, without farewell. She began walking through the village path barefoot, past the shrine, past the house where she had been given poison, past the steps where her name had once been scorned and her shadow feared. She passed her old door. No one called out. Not because they didn't care, but because there was no word that would not feel small now. The silence was not emptiness. It was reverence. When she reached the edge of the village, she did not stop. She kept walking. Down the narrow trail that led to the grove. To the place they tried to bury her. It was still there. Half-sunken. Forgotten. A hole roughly filled with earth and leaves. A marker of nothing. Not even a stone to name her. She stood beside it looking down. Then she stepped over it. One foot in front of the other. As if walking over a puddle. As if it had never mattered. The wind stirred behind her. It wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was present. And as she walked forward, the trees rustled, softly, then all at once. The leaves above shimmered like bells too delicate to chime. The path before her bent slightly as though the forest itself bowed. And then they came. The spirits. They didn't descend in fire or smoke. They didn't howl or twist or scream. They emerged gently from the trees, from the ground, from the riverbed moss and the stones that remembered. Figures of mist and memory, faceless and ageless, but unmistakably real. They followed her. Not to drag her back. Not to claim what had been promised. But to walk behind her. As witnesses. As keepers. As the only ones old enough to remember what had been done, and what had been undone. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her story would be told now, carved into stone, whispered by the wind, sung by girls who bore her name in secret. But she would not live in that story. She would go beyond it. Beyond the grave. Beyond the lie. And into the place where no one could bury her again.